Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. I'm really happy to be able to participate in any sort of TCD activities, because that was definitely one of the highlights of my professional career, was being a student, a PhD student in the TCD program. So I'm always happy to come back and see what the program is doing and the new students and everything. So thank you very much for inviting me, Marianne and Betty. I know that you're talking about community, sorry, I know that you're talking about community forest management, and I'm going to be talking about REDD today, which is very related to community forest management, and you'll see that particularly in my presentation. The title of my presentation is Safeguarded REDD, the potential to promote local participation and livelihoods at REDD sites in 6 countries. And it's a group of authors, it's a diverse group of authors, many from Indonesia, who are based at our headquarters in Bogor. And as Marianne said, we've been working on this global comparative study on REDD for many years now, and these are people who have been involved in that. So the data and everything that I'm presenting is very much a team effort between a lot of people. So I'm going to give a little bit of background about REDD. I know that you heard a presentation about the Suruí project in Brazil, but I'll just give a little bit of background about this idea of subnational REDD initiatives. And essentially, since about 2007, there's been hundreds and hundreds of subnational REDD initiatives that have emerged in the tropics. And essentially, this happened because there was a conference of parties in Bali, Indonesia, for the UNFCCC, so that's the United Nations Climate Change Framework Convention. And in 2007, they had already been debating the idea of REDD for a couple years. And at that moment, REDD kind of became consolidated as an idea, and the UNFCCC asked for demonstration activities on the ground. And at that moment, many NGOs, governments, the private sector got on board and started these demonstration REDD projects. And they're very nice because they provide on-the-ground evidence for how local people could benefit or lose from REDD, particularly in relation to respect for local rights, participation, and enhancement of livelihoods. So as the UNFCCC was consolidating this REDD idea, C4 at the same time was developing a proposal to accompany this entire REDD process. At the onset, I mean, in 2007, there was a lot of hype around it, and everyone thought that it was going to go very quickly, actually. So C4 created, was funded by the government of Norway and created an experimental design to basically follow REDD within a 4-year time frame. Well, it's now 2015, the end of 2015, and REDD has not taken off in the way that it was imagined, but it has evolved in some very interesting ways, which I'll discuss today, and a bit of the implications for local people. So essentially, some of the questions that we're looking at relate to what are known as the Cancun safeguards. So the demonstration activities started in about 2007, and at the time there was a huge concern that the carbon aspect of REDD would completely take over, and other biodiversity would be at risk, local livelihoods could be at risk. And so with a lot of civil society participation, actually, the UNFCCC adopted the Cancun safeguards in 2010, so 3 years after the onset. And basically there are 7 safeguards, and the UNFCCC says that when undertaking REDD activities, the following safeguards should be promoted and supported. So action should complement or be consistent with the objectives of national forest programs and relevant for international conventions and agreements. They should promote transparent and effective national forest governance structures. They should respect the knowledge and rights of Indigenous people and members of local communities, promote full and effective participation of relevant stakeholders, be consistent with the conservation of natural forests and biological diversity. So not converting old growth forests for something that might actually, like a plantation or things like this that, you know, who knows if the carbon balance would be better or not, and enhancing other social and environmental benefits. And then finally address the risks of reversal. So this is the idea of permanence, that while you may be offsetting forest-based emissions now, but what will that look like in 10 years, 20 years, the sort of question of how long into the future these emissions could be secured, and then reduce displacement of emissions. This is this leakage idea. So maybe you're conserving forests in one area, but the deforestation is being displaced to another area that's not protected. And what's really interesting about these safeguards is that at first they were sort of outlines for best practice for REDD. And then they actually, over the years, have become really part of the REDD rules. So now, the following year at the Conference of Parties in Durban, South Africa, basically the UNFCCC set out a system where countries that had to set up a safeguard information system. So countries actually have to show how these safeguards are being adhered to. And it even became more strict in Warsaw when the REDD framework came out in 2013, that actually said countries could not receive results-based payments if they did not have a safeguard information system in place. So these different safeguards could be monitored over time. And that is a pretty big deal because it suddenly put the carbon and non-carbon aspects of REDD almost on an equal playing field, because the reference levels for carbon were a requirement and the safeguard information systems were a requirement for the results-based payment. So it's pretty exciting actually that this has come into play, and these rules were finalized in Bonn in June, and now they're going to the Paris Climate Convention in just a couple weeks in Paris. And there's been sort of back and forth with this international climate text. It was initially 200 pages, it's now gone down to 9 pages, it's gone up again apparently to 52 pages. The role of REDD Plus is not, and the land use sector is still not completely defined, but it's in there and the safeguards are back in there. So we're really hoping for a good outcome in a few weeks, that both the land use sector will be included in this international climate change agreement, which is really important for forests and forestry, and that these safeguards will naturally accompany that because they've been part of the REDD text for the last 3-4 years. But there's still a lot to be decided. It will be a really interesting end of the year for all of us, actually. So again, C4 has been accompanying this process since nearly the beginning. And the aim of our global comparative study on REDD is to support REDD policy arenas and practitioner communities with information, analysis, and tools, and to promote what we call the 3E+ outcomes. So that's effectiveness, carbon effectiveness. REDD should actually reduce emissions from avoided deforestation and forest degradation. Efficiency, so this should be done at minimal cost. And equity, so that smallholders should not bear unfair burdens of reducing emissions, and that there should also be co-benefits, both environmental and in terms of biodiversity conservation, and social in terms of enhancing local livelihoods. And so that's the analytical framework that we've used all along. It's a huge project. It's been going on since 2009, and we're wrapping up the second phase of the study in 2015 now, sort of in conjunction with the Paris climate change event. We have applied to the Norwegian government for a third phase, and we were supposed to hear today, but they are actually so overwhelmed with this Syrian refugee crisis that a lot of their money for climate, and Norway's been a huge important donor, is now being diverted to dealing with that. as many other countries are dealing with. And so some of the initial climate change money, especially for research and civil society, is being decreased. So we won't know in a few weeks what that means for our study, but we're hoping to be able to continue to have this very longitudinal study of a very interesting process. So there's this multiple structure. There's the group that looks at REDD plus policies and processes, and maybe you've seen some of that work from the Amazon countries. That was done in Brazil, Bolivia, Peru, these country reports. The part that I'm focused on is the subnational REDD initiative, so REDD programs and projects at the sort of state or local level. And then there's a group that looks at the monitoring reference levels. And then something that's called carbon in the landscape and multi-level governance. This is sort of the how does the national level link to the state level, link to the local level, sort of both horizontally, but then also how do different ministries deal with REDD policy in terms of vertical integration. That's quite interesting too. And then finally, there's a knowledge sharing component that is, C4, many of you are probably familiar with C4's books and policy briefs and things like that, and that's what the knowledge sharing component works on. So it's a lot of people involved, actually. There's, maybe 50 people in C4 alone who are working on this and have been since 2009, and many, many consultants and students. Raíssa Guerra, who's Brazilian, she did her PhD work with this project. Denise Mello, who is also a TCD alum, participated in data collection and analysis in the state of Acre. Who else? Dawn Rodriguez Ward, who was a TCD alum, worked in Peru. So we've really been able to integrate a lot of people, actually. It's been quite interesting. So these are the REDD programs and projects that we've been following over time. There are, in the Amazon, there are 6 in Brazil and 2 in Peru. I'll read the names of those because you may be familiar with them. One is the Acre's State System of Incentives for Environmental Services, which is a state law, actually, for not only carbon, but other environmental services. The Bolsa Floresta program in Amazonas, Cotiguaçu program by the Instituto Centro de Vida in Mato Grosso, the Jari Amapá project in Jari Amapá, which is by Biofílica and the Fundação Orsa. São Félix do Xingu initiative, which is led by TNC in Brazil, and then an initiative in the Trans-Amazon that's led by IPAM that really is, well, Lucy Marçals is another person. She says she's in charge of that initiative in Pará. She's another TCD alum. And that's interesting because it's grown out of the Pro Ambiente program, which was a long-term program that other TCD students actually studied for their PhDs. So that's interesting. And then in Peru, in Madre de Dios, a program with Brazil nut collectors, and in Ucayali, a project, actually, IDER is leading that with an FSC certified Native community, collection of Native communities. So this, I think, and then there's other countries, Cameroon, Tanzania, Indonesia, and Vietnam. What this shows you is that actually a lot of these initiatives, some of them, were already projects at the time that REDD emerged. So, for example, this Ucayali project has been going on since 2003, and it was an FSC certified, sort of initiative with these 8 indigenous communities. When REDD came along, the proponents saw this as a potentially new source of funding for what they had been doing all along, and to sort of put a carbon twist on that. And we see that in many of the initiatives across the sample. I would say some that are quite different are the ones in Brazil, actually. I would say Acre is really interesting because it started out as it was called actually initially a demonstration activity across the state, but in 7 priority areas. And after an extensive stakeholder consultation process, this initiative grew to a statewide program and then actually became a state law. So really cannot even be considered a REDD project or program anymore. It's much bigger than that. in places like Coto Iguaçu and Mato Grosso, São Félix do Xingu. These are jurisdictions that are developing low emissions development strategies that can also include REDD, but really go beyond that to more of green development focus. And a lot of that just happens in Brazil. I mean, many of you know, just because Brazil is really always innovating, and it's really these bottom-up approaches. They're interacting with the international forum, but they're bringing a lot of knowledge to these debates, and came up with the idea of the Amazon Fund, which provided a lot of bilateral funding from Norway to Brazil. A lot of Brazilian scientists even came up with the idea of compensated reduction, which was the predecessor to REDD, where offsets could come from forests. So Brazil's quite interesting, actually, in the 6 countries that we're studying. Tanzania, for example, is very different. It's kind of the classic REDD project discourse. Okay, you create a carbon baseline, you do some measurements, you create some maps, you outline how you're going to obey the safeguards. It's sort of this A, B, C, D, and the projects in Tanzania sort of follow this more by the rules. And you really don't see that in a place like Brazil. In Peru and Indonesia, you also see some innovation, but in the African countries, less so. So I give you that background because it really relates to this whole idea of community forest management. REDD is not something different. It's a lot of what's been going on all along, and that's actually why I think our study is interesting, independent of what happens to REDD, because we are looking at forest interventions and what they mean for local livelihoods and local people. So we worked in 190 villages in over 4,500 households in these places. And we followed a robust method, this before-after control intervention method, and we are providing empirical evidence of what is succeeding and failing in REDD with respect to effectiveness, efficiency, equity, and co-benefits, as I mentioned before, the 3E+. And so basically we have control sites and intervention sites. The before was in 2010 and 2011. We conducted, basically we found matching villages. So we went to the site, we worked with the organization that was leading the REDD initiative to select about 15 communities where they might be doing what they were calling REDD interventions, and 15 where they were not. And we collected a lot of secondary data on those, and then we conducted a principal components analysis to try and match these communities on different characteristics, on key characteristics. And of that, at each site we then have 4 intervention communities and 4 control communities that we did the work in the before period, and then we go into the after period, and 3 to 4 years later to collect the same sort of livelihoods, governance. Biodiversity data we did not actually do a lot of primary field work on. We did it much more of a socioeconomic study in the end because of the fieldwork expense. But we are looking at forest cover change and using satellite imagery and biomass maps to get a sense of at least some of the biophysical aspect. So this on paper is a very robust design, but you can imagine what it looks like in the field. And I'll get into some of that as we move along. So relating some of our findings to the Cancun safeguards. The 4th Cancun safeguard, again, is this full and effective participation of relevant stakeholders. So we are asking, are local people aware of these REDD initiatives, and do they participate in the design and implementation? And so at all of these sites, a big part of our survey question to local farmers was, have you heard of REDD actually first as a concept? Have you heard of such and such projects, as the organizations were calling them? And then asking them how they participated. And here's some of the results from this is from the first phase, actually, of the work. And this is the local knowledge of REDD in over 2,000 households in the early sample. So what we can see here is that in the early stage, only about 22% of households, or a quarter, had heard about REDD, which is not surprising. I mean, a concept like that, that's actually kind of high. About 34 had heard about the local REDD initiative, and the primary source of information was from the proponent organizations. That said, we at the time thought that this was pretty low because these interventions had started, and they were there was still somewhat of a low level of any sort of knowledge among households about the project that was going on in their villages. And so on the graph here, you can see, so if they had said that they had heard about the local REDD project, we asked them what they understood it to be. And you can see the big green line in all of these cases is forest protection or improvement. So actually most of the people who had heard about the REDD initiative understood it to be about forest protection or improvement. And then some, you know, a much lesser degree, thought it was about income or welfare improvement. You know, there were a few other sort of responses, and or did not know actually. So they had heard of the project, they didn't actually know what it was doing. And then we asked about local participation in REDD. So of those who knew or had a general sense of what the REDD project or program was, you know, how many had actually participated. And so 27% of the households aware of the local REDD initiative had participated in the early design or implementation. But that participation was mostly passive or consultative. So meaning they went to a meeting about REDD. But very, very few people, maybe a few community leaders, actually had conversations with the different NGOs or government proponents about what the interventions should look like. We're now analyzing some of our after data. We're calling after, it's really midway through data, but we're analyzing the data from the second period now, and knowledge has gone up remarkably to, you know, 60 to 70% of people aware of the REDD initiative, which is good. But what we find is that the participation is still this passive consultative participation. It's still going to meetings, it's still listening to people present things that will be implemented in the area, but very little opportunity for actual feedback from farmers and forest users. In this first period, we also asked what the local hopes and worries for the REDD initiatives were. And what you see along this graph, it's sort of turned around now. The colors are the different countries. And then you have hopes and worries. That's the H and the W. And what you can see is that when we asked people about their concerns or hopes for these different projects or programs, most of the hopes and the worries focused on income or welfare issues. So we're really hoping that REDD will give us a new source of income. We're really worried that REDD will restrict our forest access and we won't be able to clear forests for agriculture anymore, or things like this. So really related to their livelihoods. Followed by this idea of forest protection. So the hopes, you know, that REDD would actually help protect local forests, the worries that it would be ineffective in terms of conservation because there were bigger actors at play in these areas that REDD would not be able to you know, disincentivize, I guess. And then it sort of goes down the line, you know, sort of climate and carbon hopes and worries. This idea of initiative continuity, this was really important, and this relates, you know, to everything we see in community forest management, that a big worry was that the initiatives would not really get off the ground, and if they did, they would not actually continue. This is, you know, there's a lot of disillusionment with these initiatives. You know, people come in with all of these promises, one after another, and now REDD is the latest one, and farmers and others are pretty tired of a lot of this. Then there are other issues with tenure security and governance and adaptation and things like this. And then we also looked at our findings as relate to the Cancun Safeguard, the fifth Cancun Safeguard. And this is the conservation of natural resources and enhancement of other social and environmental benefits. And again, so here we're asking, can REDD interventions actually promote or enhance local livelihoods? And this I want to start with because when we look at REDD interventions, I think many of us think, oh, it's a payment. So someone is paying a farmer to stop deforestation or to change their land use behavior or whatever. And actually, I think that's the idea of compensated reduction and sort of the predecessor to REDD, or at the national level, that's maybe what it's about. It's about developed countries supporting forested developing countries, paying for performance of reduced deforestation at that higher level. But actually, when you get to the ground, REDD interventions are a diverse basket of things, from enabling conditions like tenure regularization, environmental education, technology improvements, credit, insurance. This is what a lot of people call REDD readiness activities, and a lot of the early multilateral and bilateral funding from the World Bank, from the German Development Bank, have been focused on readiness activities before anything else starts. And then there's, in the blue below, this disincentives, so regulatory measures, prohibitions, rules, and fines. For those who work in Brazil, we know how important disincentives are. The IBAMA fines and the monitoring, the helicopter flyovers, all of this really has been, a lot of the reductions in deforestation have been attributed to these measures. So there is an important role for command and control. But then we also need to look at the incentives as part of this basket, and there's the payments for environmental services. A lot of people, would call REDD a big payment for environmental services scheme, but actually this is just a piece of what REDD looks like on the ground. There's subsidies, there's actual cash payments, provision of inputs, tax exemptions, certification systems, and things like this. So this is this basket, and when we looked at our sites, the 23 that we're working at, we actually found that there's more incentives than other types of REDD interventions. There's a total of about 208 distinct interventions at the 23 sites. Many sites have about 10 different interventions that are happening. And there's more incentives than other types. But interestingly, of the incentives, only about 13% are conditional on sustainable land use behaviors. And so that's 7% of all interventions conditional. This is really important because one of the exciting things about REDD when it came out, I guess, was this idea of payment for performance. So there was this conditionality aspect that integrated conservation and development programs did not necessarily have. And so that's why many people who had worked in the forestry sector for decades saw this as something new, because there was this performance and conditionality element. But when you get to the ground level, the conditionality isn't necessarily there. And that's kind of interesting. So when we look at local livelihoods, we also have to understand what local people are doing in terms of forest change, forest clearing. Again, I said we're measuring this with satellite data as well, but this is from the survey data where we actually asked landholders if they had cleared land in one parcel of forest in the 2 years prior to the survey. And as you can see, this is the average household clearing among the 2,000 that were responding to this question. And so the total basically in Brazil was about, it was the largest amount in Brazil was just 2.5 hectares per year, which is actually quite low when we think about it. And this is the total clearing and then the amount of the clearing used for crops. So about 41% of the households interviewed had cleared at least one parcel of forest in the 2 years prior to the survey. And importantly, a lot of that was used for agriculture. And mostly growing food for the household. And this is important because if we're talking about avoiding deforestation at that level, you are talking about food security for local people, especially if that's what a lot of their forest clearing is going towards. And it's something important to think about. I mean, in Brazil, there's just been this huge shift in focus from the large landholder to now that a lot of the deforestation is being done on these small polygons, and so smallholders. And this is throughout the tropics. It's been very interesting for me to be in Indonesia because the REDD initiatives here, it's the same thing. It's the shifting cultivation. And I was just at a meeting with some government officials last week who were saying we have to teach local farmers that they don't need to burn to grow food, and we have to teach them to be more environmentally sustainable. And I mean, what's going on in Indonesia right now. There's massive, it's maybe the largest environmental crisis, and it's mostly the Asian paper and pulp company that's responsible for it. It's not small farmers, but what we do see across the tropics, I would say, is this focus on we've got to stop swidden agriculture. We've got to stop shifting cultivation, and that's pretty worrisome, actually, and it's across all the sites. And then when we look at the household income shares at these sites, and we asked very detailed sort of subsistence and cash type questions in terms of sort of every types of products collected and used, both for subsistence and sale. We see, again, the blue here is income share from crops, the gray is income share from livestock, and the green is income share from forest. So in all cases, of course, income share from crops, including subsistence, is mostly the highest, except for this one site in Peru. Actually, the two sites in Peru, these are kind of unique sites because at the Madre de Dios site, it's Brazil nuts that are contributing to a lot of the cash income. And at the Adair site, it's timber and fish. Actually, the fish is for the subsistence and the timber is for the cash income. So that's what really pushes up the forest income share in those cases. In the others, it's a little bit lower. Even in Brazil, livestock and crops are the others. And what's missing in the Brazil shares that's not shown here are the bolsas, the Bolsa Familia, the pensions, all of these things that really contribute make an important contribution to the livelihoods portfolios in that context. So what we do see is some nice actually alignment between some of the REDD interventions and local livelihoods, aside from this swidden agriculture thing that I keep seeing, and it sort of bothers me more and more as I see it. But we do see that, for example, at these two sites in Brazil where livestock, this is now showing the income shares in a pie graph instead of as bars. So the purple here is, on the top is the percent of cash and subsistence income that comes from livestock, milk included, actually, here. And you can see here that at these two sites, the proponents are looking at sustainable milk production in Coto Iguaçu as a major intervention strategy, and in São Felix do Xingu looking at best practices for cattle ranching as a major strategy for smallholders. In Madre de Dios and Ucayali, where I mentioned that the forest share is very high, well, one of the key interventions is the local Brazil nut processing plant in Madre de Dios, so that local people can actually get a greater share of the profit from being closer to the supply chain, having a bigger role in that, and also the small scale timber production in Ucayali. This FSC certification is the big focus there. But livelihood portfolios are heterogeneous, and we all know this, but this is sort of interesting. This shows the percent of sort of total variation in terms of the shares of incomes per site. And just to make a long story short here, when you have sort of the big circles show a lot of within site heterogeneity. So communities being very different, and that's a little bit, of course, that's we know that that's true, and the somewhat worrisome thing about this is that proponents often sort of have all colonist farmers will get this kind of intervention, and all indigenous people will get this kind of intervention, and then forest extractivists will get this intervention. And it's sort of this blanket idea that really is not taking in that within site variation, especially some of these bigger sites. These are the Indonesian sites where there's a lot of variation in particular. And then the within community variation, and this just really shows, you know, basically how households, the bottom photo, or the bottom graph is really showing the diversity of households in one community. So even when you feel like you have a community profile figured out, the livelihood, the share of income from these different livelihood sources is completely different, of course, among different households. And how do you design interventions to really benefit this diversity of farmers and other forest and land users? So some of our early conclusions that I think are relevant not only to REDD, but to really any, you know, anything that even comes down the line now, or community forestry of the past, or even integrated conservation and development programs, that there still are generally low levels of local participation in subnational REDD, even with these explicit safeguards in place, low levels of information, especially at the initial stages, and still passive participation. Forest clearing and reliance on agriculture are important characteristics of local livelihoods at most sites across the 6 countries. And this really highlights the importance of complementing disincentives with incentives. So if you are actually going to say that a farmer cannot clear a certain amount of forest, that there is some sort of compensation for that, because otherwise you really are impacting potentially local livelihoods. And this livelihood heterogeneity makes it challenging to design REDD interventions that do no harm and promote social benefits. And you know, this is the persistent challenge. You do have to create policies. You do have to create programs and projects that are not incredibly complex. You do have to create indicators so that you can monitor these projects without having to necessarily visit every household and, you know, at every site. But so how can you do this in a way that really takes into account this heterogeneity, and really the importance of involving local people in developing an effective and equitable mix of interventions. I can't tell you how many times I heard when I would go to the field sites, there were only a couple sites in the Brazilian Amazon where actually payments were being given. But let's say they were 50 reais per month, which is pretty low. You know, this is now what, $12 or something, $15 per month. And a lot of the farmers in that case, you know, the other things were going on. You know, they would have the payment, they would also have a land use planning process, they would also maybe have a fish pond, or, you know, chickens that were being delivered to farmers, all these sort of different kinds of interventions. And many people would say, please tell them, because we're asking, do you have recommendations about these programs? And many people would say, please tell them not to pay us. We don't want this money, because by the time we actually get on the bus, get to the city, open the bank account, stay with our relatives, buy food, get back to our lodge, we've actually spent more money than the money that they're giving us. So, you know, and they of course had millions of other ideas for what actually would be more effective. You know, what about a freezer for freezing fruits that are wild fruits that are being collected for later sale, things like this. I mean, of course, farmers know what is going to motivate them, and what's really interesting, of course, I mean, forest protection is actually, it's very important to local people. Of course it is, especially people who are living in these forest environments. And many people want to conserve, of course. But they also need to eat. They need to feed their families. They need to survive. These are pretty precarious situations. And so if local people were actually involved in developing this mix, it could be much more effective. So that's the end of my presentation. I hope we can discuss. I just wanted to acknowledge our donors and provide you with a few links on our study and then this Red on the Ground casebook that we came up with last year that has a chapter for each of the 23 sites that we're working on, and then a REDD safeguards packet that talks about some of these issues related to the data that we've been collecting. And we have a brief on biodiversity, we have a brief on gender, we have a brief on benefit sharing, tenure, monitoring safeguards. So please do check that out also. And thank you very much.